What's going on, y'all? Welcome to the Chain Reaction Podcast. I am your host, Jeremiah Mitchell, joined today by Jeremiah Harding. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing reasonably. You?
Not bad, not bad. I should let our future audience know what day it is today. It's August 20th, 2017. And the reason why that's important is because currently in the U.S., we have collectively decided that the most important issue of the day is removing inanimate objects from their perches, and that all moral outrage must be directed toward such activities. People are getting a lot of credit on social media for being against slavery and racism. So it's fun to watch from an outside perspective. Pissing me off a little bit.
Well, it's all virtue signaling nonsense, really. What it amounts to is, jumping on a bandwagon that you weren't on for the past very long time. Like, most of these people, first off, most of these people have not researched the Civil War. They're parroting what they were told in school and expecting a shiny sticker for it. It's terrible. But beyond that, you have the idea of jumping on this particular bandwagon being the bandwagon that will be something that will be perpetually jump-onable the whole time Trump is in office. Because, like, racism doesn't mean anything anymore. Since since the left specifically has watered down racism to mean, racial discrimination or racial bias on a societal level.
White. For some of them,
for anyone who isn't white, and oftentimes saying that being white is racist, like you just pointed out, like all white people are racist. So the word has lost all of its power, all of it. But beyond that, Trump is in office, and everybody can now scream about white supremacy for the next, 8 years, because he's going to be there that long. There's going to be some major unifying, crystallizing conflict that he will be on the right side of, just like Obama, just like Bush, just like Clinton. To be honest, he was very unpopular, and then he distracted everybody with like the bombing of a Sudanese pharmaceutical factory. Like, this shit goes back, and fucking Nixon with his Watergate thing, but also with the troop surges in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Like, it's really obvious that the way the presidency works is because it distracts people from what's really being done to them.
Yeah.
So
Gore does a great job solidifying the president in office for an extra term, for sure. Every time. If Desert Storm would have lasted a little longer, maybe we would have had 8 years of the first Bush.
Yeah, well, we would have had 8 years of the first Bush if he hadn't gotten everything he needed to do done in the first 4.
Perot
Hi there. Yeah. Well, I mean, but he wanted to establish a new world order, and in order to do that, you need to have a left-right march. Never a middle march, never a backward march. It's always got to be a left-right march, advancing the agenda of the state, growing regulations, and expanding the government's power. And then eventually, when the government's power expands to a certain extent within its borders, you have to expand it without its borders. So it's got to spread like a cancerous disease to other parts of the globe. And when you get that sort of thing, it has to keep ramping up and ramping up. But you can't just keep doing the same ramping up every 4 years. So you've got to have a pre-planned winners and losers so that you can constantly have a left-right march and serve the power of the elites.
I don't think that's necessary, because people tend to react and respond in that way anyway. They tend to be reactionary all the time.
Well, except that they didn't, because Obama won popular, I think, both terms, and Hillary won popular this term, but Trump won electoral, which means that, the popular vote would have swung left, by the numbers. And so realistically, they need to plan this stuff because this presidency is not of the people. Most people didn't even vote. They voted for nobody. But the people who did vote, most of them voted for Hillary. So I don't think the argument can be made that the people will automatically swing one way or another. Certainly,
No, not
Obama,
automatically. Of course not.
right.
But there is a tendency. I mean, you see that with the moral outrage. I feel like a lot of this, not all, but I feel like a lot of this white nationalist stuff is itself a reaction to the way that people have been talking about white people and all the bad things they've done for decades. You feel
Well,
like you're almost an
yeah.
ostracized, marginalized group that doesn't understand how other people feel, and that for some reason, no matter what happened to you growing up and what your situation was in life, you are deemed privileged because of a lack of melanin.
Well, and that, you know, but the white lash, which I hate that term, but the white lash is
But black
is a
lash
cultural
sounds
thing.
cool.
Yeah, well, um, except that it sounds like cosmetology products. But beyond that,
Nice.
the white lash is a cultural thing, and it's necessary to solidify the idea that Trump is a president because it's time for the white people to have their say, the middle class Americans and all that. But they didn't vote him in. The Electoral College did. So it's a cultural necessity to have that bandied about in the media and reflected like between parties who have a shared interest in either supporting or opposing the narrative. But it wasn't necessary to get the vote. The vote was what the elites had planned and probably gerrymandered for a long time to get there.
Yeah, I don't believe that that's necessarily true. That's a possible explanation, but I don't even think it is the most likely one.
Well, I mean,
think we've
why
already
though? Because he
talked
lost popular.
What's that?
I mean, why though? Because he lost popular.
Because the electoral college votes that voted for him were from areas where he won the popular vote. So the popular vote in electoral college went as it quote unquote should, according.
Well, I'd have to look into that, and I'd have to look into whether or not the districts were redrawn based on polling numbers, because realistically, I think gerrymandering is much more to blame than a lot of people want to admit for presidential results.
Yeah, gerrymandering is an incessant thing, so I'm sure a lot of districts were redrawn. They are every year.
Well, right. So the question is who redrew them, why, and who paid them to redraw them in that way? Because it's not free. This is all exchanged for political favors. So I'd like to know
it's
what.
just the people in office who are trying to maintain political power for their party. It's not necessarily a favor to anyone except to themselves.
But the district lines that are redrawn by certain people with certain connections. The only reason they get redrawn is because it serves somebody's interests. Whether that interest is on a direct party level or not is, I guess, debatable, but I would strongly doubt that.
Yeah, I would be surprised if districts were redrawn by party members to make it not in favor of their party.
Well, in favor of them and not in favor of their party is regular. I mean, that's what Trump is. The majority of Republicans don't like Trump. Well, at least establishment Republicans don't like Trump publicly, but he's in anyway. So, I mean, obviously, votes happen contrary to party position. Obviously,
right?
Hillary and most Hillary supporters were only supporting her so that they could fuck Trump. The idea of any party being like directly representative of the people in it is sort of absurd to me.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's not a point I've even come close to making.
Well, no, I mean, but if people in the districts were like electors in the districts were voting according to their district, then Trump wouldn't be there as far as I'm concerned. Because most people in most districts likely didn't vote for Trump in that sort of way. And most people didn't even vote. If you really want to dig into it, non-voting should have been there should have been a redraw until enough voters voted for one or the other that somebody could get in. And if nobody could reach a satisfactory agreement, then it should have been completely scrapped. We should have found a different way. But that's the system doesn't respect the wishes of the people, is
Well,
what I'm saying.
no.
And
I
so
mean, democracy and representative democracy is horrible, but the notion that it's some sort of centrally planned thing, I don't think is the most likely explanation. And we see the areas, for the most part, there were some protest votes, but the areas in which Trump won the popular vote are the places where the Electoral College voted for him to be the president. So the
well,
system
I'll
just
look into
worked
that
the way it was supposed
specifically.
to. All right, sounds good. Yeah, it'll be interesting. I want to stay on some of the stuff happening right now because we can get bogged down in these weeds and not get anywhere. I also in news this week, U.S. coalition bombings in Raqqa. I think that's right.
It's Raqqa.
Raqqa. There were 59 civilian deaths in a 3-day period, at least. Estimates are that 21 of them were children. And I'm just curious, y'all, how much outrage on social media did you see about that? How many people did you see getting out there and virtue signaling about the dead kids from the U.S. these days, from the Trump administration? I mean, if you want to talk about Trump's evil stuff, him not condemning white nationalism strong enough is a pretty pathetic and pretty small scale thing to criticize him on. You want to get him on
It's
something
pennies.
substantive? How about murdering kids? And here's the kicker: the bombs that were dropped were called laser guided precision barrel bombs. So they were so precise they only resulted in the deaths of 60 civilians. So either they were directly targeting civilians or they just don't give a fuck about innocent life.
Well, they certainly don't. The only thing that they care about with regard to that is how the numbers look to the press. But if the press doesn't talk about it, at least the mainstream press, or if it's just one of those ridiculous scrolling tickers at the bottom of the latest news related to human interest stories and what truck seems the best for braving the summer sands, then it doesn't matter. The civilians can die. Actually, I'm going to write something on this particular subject. I'll write an article. I want to say between now and the next time we record, and it'll be fairly substantive on this issue, because honestly, that's proof that Americans are more racist as average civilians than they are as protesters for or against any goddamn statue.
You think that's a racist issue?
Why is it not? I mean, those people are a different race from the majority of Americans, and they are in a far-off land, and Americans can care a lot about a white nationalist killing a white person, but they can't give a fuck about a lot of brown people being bombed constantly by U.S. foreign policy. They don't give a shit, really.
Well, I think the far off land part is what has the most to do with it. I mean, there are definitely people who are racist against Arabs, but most of the ones I've talked to that have come across that way the most, it's not necessarily Arabs, but Muslims in general. I think they kind of do a conflation of the two groups. Most people I've talked to who come across that way, which I didn't even remember these conversations till this moment, had been in the military and actually been involved directly in conflict with people who were, of Arab descent.
Well, okay,
it's not
but
an excuse. I mean, it's still stupid to think in collectivist ways like that. But
Right.
Makes some sense.
The point I'm making is that the left loves to talk about institutional racism when it's a statue looking down at them and hurting their feelings. But it doesn't look the left doesn't like to talk about and focus on, typically anyway, the majority of them, the institutional racism of, like, the real institutional racism of a war in a country with people that are deemed less than, and therefore we can kill them. That's to me a much more racist ideal than having General Robert E. Lee, who wanted to end slavery, by the way, who thought the institution was bad before
Right.
it was cool. Um, you know, Looking down at them, it's much better to have an evil meanie statue looking down at you than it is to have a bomb dropped on your village. And the fact that people don't give a shit about that bomb dropped on that village, when if it was dropped on the inner city or if it was dropped on white suburbia, they would suddenly scream either one side or another about racism or prejudice or whatever. The issue only bothers them when it hits home. So they're not actually for racism or against racism. They're they're supporting the ideal because it suits them at the time, and that means that they're more racist than they, like, remotely appreciate or understand, because they're supporting the system by asking it to help them but not stopping it from hurting others.
Yeah, I don't think I would call that institutional racism. I would just call that lack of respect for human life for people that are
Well, no, I mean,
outside
on
of
their
the
part it
U.S.
is, but they're supporting the institutions that are oftentimes racist in their reasons, you know? The military doesn't say, let's go kill us some civilians and some military targets. They say, yeah, let's go kill some raggies. I've heard the rhetoric. I know a lot of military people, and the racism inside those institutions is very strong.
Yeah, that could be. I don't have any evidence to the contrary, and it would make sense that it is. Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot of individual exceptions, obviously, but in order to kill people, for the most part, especially when it comes to using aggression to kill people, not just in self defense, it takes a lot of, like you said, otherizing. You have to turn them into something that is of a wholly different type of creature than you are, or a different enough kind of human being that they are worth less, so killing them is okay. And all
Hmm.
whatever ways people can come up with to do that in their own mind, and institutions can come up with, like the military, finding ways to demonize people. Racism is a good tool for that. Go ahead.
Especially academy, like the private paramilitary contractors who used to be XE and who used to be Blackwater. Academy, they're very racist. They've been instructed in the past and followed through on these instructions to just go in and start shooting people wholesale. Same with, what's the other one? There's another very strong military contractor. If I can think of the name, I'll look it up. But
Wait,
the,
Blackwater? Did you say that one? Not Black.
I said
But
academy because it,
okay,
it used
I
to
don't
be
know.
XE and XE used to be Blackwater.
Oh,
Blackwater doesn't exist anymore.
okay. Well, then I don't know anymore. I don't keep that up to date on that sort of stuff. There's too many.
Well, I sort of have to because I'm the resident tinfoiler, so um, so I have to keep track of the names renaming constantly, because that's honestly what I think lets the U.S. get away with a lot of what it gets away with, is just renaming things instead of stopping the program at all.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Al
yeah,
Qaeda
like,
learned that from the U.S. I think, where they
wait,
keep renaming splinter groups to all these different names that aren't Al Qaeda in order to get moral support from people in the area and some sympathy from the West, as well as provide sort of a cover when the West, U.S., Qatar, Saudi Arabia provides them weapons. Like,
yeah,
well, it's not Al
well,
Qaeda, yeah, but they're loyal to Al Qaeda. They're a splinter group of Al Qaeda. They're not Al Qaeda in name only.
and it's not like Al Qaeda is basically a sister branch of the Taliban, And the fact that that's the case, and ISIS sort of sprang out of that, means that they can have basically, like you said, Splinter. It's decentralized,
Yeah.
and they can have countless institutions bent on the same policies and the same mission, the same jihad and the same fatwa, and they can consistently go in and recruit people under their new label, whatever is trendy. And in about a year or so, I guarantee that they'll have a new group that won't be ISIS, that will be very prolific on social media, that the social media institutions will have to block, because um, you know there's only so far that Iraq and Syria can specifically go before they need to branch out to other states. And since the fundamentalists from those areas, being sort of influenced and trained by the CIA, need certain incentives, we've got a huge pool to pull from, especially with Yemen and Libya coming into unrest. Kuwait still being a tunnel through which U.S. troops can go to get to other countries. Like, there's a huge amount of people there with very strong incentive to take action. And if you could rename it to be more approachable to all of those other groups, then there could be a unified Middle Eastern radicalization system that, at the very least, represented more ideals of more types of Muslims, and got more support from those radicals in those regions. So, a year or two, give it a year or two, and there'll be another.
You're dropping out. You said
Oh,
give it a year or two. Yeah, I want to say
yeah.
like the Taliban itself is largely an enemy right now of these other jihadist groups, like the Al Qaeda linked groups and
Well,
ISIS.
enemy.
Well, they fight them when they get into Afghanistan when they have the opportunity. Uh, but it's just a splinter off the ideology that is significant enough that they become enemies, and like it is sort of in a sense like Afghanistan is sort of Taliban's territory in terms of a nation, a nation state, in as much as a nation state's territory is its territory. They don't they don't run things there as much right now, but they still hold a very large presence and they control the area. So if ISIS or Al Qaeda get in their area and try to take it over, they are incentivized by more than just religion to fight them off in those regions. And all this stuff, like you're saying, I was just thinking about it. It's complicated. Syria is so fucking complicated with the, I don't know, 85 different groups of people fighting there for various reasons, both for defense and to control things and to overturn things and to create chaos and to make money and to maintain an oil pipeline or acquire an oil pipeline. That's just in Syria. And then we also have Libya, that the U.S. was heavily involved, are aligning itself with these Salafist jihadist groups in order to overthrow Gaddafi. And Yemen being destroyed by Saudi Arabia. All this stuff is super complicated. So it's hard to make it something the public is aware of. I mean, I'm more aware than almost anyone I know, and keeping things straight in my head is impossible. More aware than anyone I know in person. Lots of my friends online are more aware of this shit than I am. So it's easy. It's really easy to get outraged about slavery and statues, and it's a really clear, simple moral message to jump on. And there are very simple narratives surrounding slavery and surrounding racism and surrounding the North and the South and Nazis and white nationalists. The narratives around there are so simple that it makes people more inclined to jump aboard this sort of moral criticism. But they make things so complex, and the area is so complex in the Middle East that I think it's harder to find a slogan or a single sentence solution to the problem, where you can just say remove the statues, and everyone thinks you're heroic and advocating for something really moral, whereas
Just
ending the war,
denounce
people don't.
Nazis. That's all you have to do.
Just denounce Nazis. It's yeah. I think I tweeted this week that there is nothing more courageous than publicly declaring that you are against racism. So that was just perfect for what other people were saying about this shit. It's it's one of these
Yeah.
things. Do you want to talk about how the Antifa and alt right are similar? I feel like you can jump into that more if you want to.
Sure.
Yeah.
So
I didn't want to talk about foreign policy too much. It's
first
just so
off,
important.
I mean, I could go on for probably an hour on that alone, especially with the whole U.S. and the Middle East thing, having not created any more stability than, like, well, having not created any more stability than not having been involved in those regional conflicts would have.
Oh, it's
for the
way
past,
more
you know,
unstable than it would
fucking
have been.
60 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because they go in there and they're doing it to destabilize region. That's it. They're doing it to destabilize regions so that they can claim that they stabilized and repaired everything.
All right, Harding. I think we got to reconnect via Skype because you are cutting out. So you wanted to hang up and call back?
Okay.
All right.
Yeah.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, like Jeremiah Harding was saying, it's part of the reason is to destabilize. I think there are a lot of factors that go into that, including national interests and just the sheer amount of money and power that is acquired by going to war over and over again. And if you can always maintain a reason to go to war, or the semblance of a reason to go to war, you can always keep those military contractors happy and give the people another reason to take away more of their freedom, to take more of their resources through taxation and the sneaky way through inflating the currency via the Federal Reserve and the reserve banking system. War is the health of the state. I can't remember who said that, but it has proven true over and over and over again in my life. And the U.S. has found a way to stay in perpetual war almost since a few years after its inception. And they are very healthy. That is a healthy state. Education helps too, controlling that aspect.
Yeah.
All right. More.
So,
directly.
if I'm coming through clear,
yeah, you're good.
yeah. All right. Cool. So, like, the Antifa alt-right thing is an attempt to say that those who aren't represented by the top echelons, at least the publicly known top echelons of society, couldn't possibly be like equally corrupt to those at the top echelons of society, or who are represented by it. The idea of the Antifa isn't to be anti-fascist, it's to be anti-anything to the right of them. Because if you're to the right of them, at least in terms of politics, then they'll call you part of the problem until you join the left. That's the problem. And so the alt-right shows up, and they're actually the example of the extreme right that the alt-right tries to paint everybody as. But
yeah, and
they have this clash going on between the ideals.
Sorry, we keep. I think we have too much of a delay. But the alt-right that I think you're talking about is more like the white nationalist, neo-Nazi side of the alt-right, correct? They're more directly, like, it's a very fringe portion of the alt-right even that is in that category, in more direct contrast with Antifa.
Well, yeah, and they get to make it seem like everybody on the right is sort of equally complicit to the marchers that they saw. They get to take very dramatic pictures of people with torches, and they get to say, these are the example of everybody over there. But if you try and say that the Antifa, who came like armed and ready to fight people, or the Antifa at other instances who have, you know, hit people with bike clocks and you know, gone about wrecking public spaces and, you know, throwing homemade bombs into crowds and shit like that. Those people are obviously not representative of Antifa, but these people are representative of literally the whole right, and it's all because Trump is in power, and that's the polarization issue. But it's part of the divide and conquer agenda that the elites have been planning for a very long time now, and the way that they do that is they will play on people's insecurities.
Yeah, I didn't,
why not?
I didn't, because, you know, I was just more hopeful. I was it did not feel like most people I knew cared about race 15 years ago. And now it's like a big topic of conversation, and talking to someone about race who has more melanin in their skin to you than you do is a really big deal, as if that fucking matters. Now, I know that lots of people have experienced racism, myself included, incredibly minor, just a few negative words and criticisms. I've been hurt a lot more outside of racist context. So I care about people's individual stories of other dumbasses that treated them in a negative way because of the amount of melanin in their skin. But that we would be at a place where, as a whole, millions and tens of millions of people in the U.S. care a lot about race and think it's a really important issue, as opposed to thinking rationally about the subject and that it's merely an arbitrary division between humans, categorical division, and it's become such that it's no longer a concept. Not that it never was a concept, it was always intended to divide. But if we want to think about race rationally, we should think about it as variations in color and variations in country of origin or region of origin, not as categorical differences that have to do with identity.
Because that's
identity,
the thing, though.
Categorical differences. What's that?
Yeah, well, that's the thing, though. I mean, whiteness specifically has been for a very long time a categorical exclusion basis, because the idea of whiteness wasn't even around until like 1800, when they needed to say that white people could be slaves.
Yeah.
You know, so when they decided who could be slaves, it was anybody pretty much dark, and that meant that a lot of people who were in the category suddenly weren't. They were very happy about that, but the rest of the people weren't so happy about that, and that meant that for a very long time now, everything has been based on either enabling one class or the other, and that creates division. The division that the elites are all too happy to capitalize on, and have done so for the past, several decades, especially, and for the past couple centuries, pretty generally. So now that there are more people here, the more you can divide them based on race, the better you can control them, because you don't even need to get people to control. You don't even need to control people on an individual level anymore if you're an elite. All you need to do is get people to be so polarized and angry with each other that they will control each other implicitly. And that means that essentially you've got cattle that self-police. You've got tax cattle that don't need your guiding hand to force them to do anything. You've got cattle that will fight each other into the chutes.
Yeah. And I think along with that, one of the most important things that the media does as a whole to really control people is that they control the topic of conversation. It's not just the media's biased perspective on different topics, but they are largely the determiners of what the topics are that we're discussing about what's happening in the world today. And when you can make it about something that is so relatively trivial, about a few hundred neo-Nazis or a couple hundred white nationalist fools that think that they're or have preferences, in-group preferences based on skin color, or removing statues are the most important things that can be discussed, when that becomes the central topic that people are inclined to share their opinion about, then you've already lost any sort of chance of substantial change based upon public perspective and change of opinion, because you're talking about something that is not totally unimportant, but minimally important. Did you catch
Well,
that?
yeah, and not to mention that,
Yeah.
but that means that like when the elites need to control something, all they need to do is point at one of these groups now and say they're the bad guys, and that means that essentially the white supremacists are creating the system that the people they say are in a massive conspiracy against white people can really benefit from. They're creating the conspiracy and then crying when it comes to fruition. It's terrible.
Yeah, sorry, y'all. We're having a huge Skype delay today, so the conversation is a little more stilted than normal. If you're just listening via audio, there is a chance I will cut out some of the silence, but there's also a good chance I won't, depending on how busy I am with the boy tonight. This one of the biggest conflicts happening right now, I'm going to take us in a bit of a different direction, is due to, like I keep talking about, the statues. People are removing statues all over. People are having protests to keep them and protests to knock them down. Even like a Lenin statue in Washington somewhere is being knocked down at the behest of some people on the right who are crying out for fairness. And I'm not really interested in having much of an opinion about whether or not these statues should be knocked down, because I'm not gonna sit here and defend a bunch of statist statues and say we should keep them up or should not keep them up. I think there's a potential danger of seeking to erase history in these things, but so much of history is already erased just by the public education system. I'm not really convinced that knocking down a few statues is going to have a significant impact on that, although I definitely might be wrong. But this conflict, what I wanted to say is this conflict is all created because it's public property, quote unquote property, and it is not a private property system. It's a system in which taxpayers, in many cases, were forced under threat of death, because that's what taxes are, to pay for the building of these statues. When forced under the threat of death to pay for the government to acquire these various properties and and build these buildings and establish these government-owned areas. So there becomes this problem then, because whose property is the statue? There's this question that there is no good answer to, because a fictional organization, which is really just a group of people whose existence is dependent on theft, can't be said to rightfully own anything, because everything that they own was taken from others by force. So they don't, in an ethical sense, they don't have the right to decide what to do with the property. And the way that they choose to handle deciding what to do with government property is through, in very, very, very indirectly through a representative democracy. And what it really ends up being with these statues is people gauging what's public opinion and what is going to get me the most amount of goodwill for my future political career, either keeping the statue up or taking it down, and then they make a decision based on that. But really, everyone, in a sense, has a right to determine, every individual, what happens with the statue. And in a sense, no individual has a right to determine what happens with the statue because everyone was stolen from and everyone was violated by the state in different ways, and everyone deserves different sort of compensation for the violations that they have experienced. So the land there, I think, from my perspective, and the statue ultimately falls into the category of unowned, homesteadable land ethically, but because of government violence, it is land held in common by a coercive force. So you have this thing called the tragedy of the commons, which is an economic idea that when you have property in common, I'm gonna try to summarize it in a way that's relevant. When you have property in common, individuals are going to tend to abuse it because no one really has the rightful say about what should be done with it. So you can't just say, well, there's X number of taxpayers in this area, so everyone owns this particular portion of this land because some's more valuable than others, or everyone has a 1/100,000th say in what happens with this land, because that's still functionally unowned. There's no really right ethical solution, and because this land is held in common, there is inevitable conflict when people disagree about what to do with it, and you're left without any sort of reasonable or consistent or ethical way to make decisions about what happens with these statues and what happens on this property and who can gather here and who can't, because it's essentially controlled by an organization that has no right to centrally control it. Now contrast this with private property. All this conflict pretty much goes away. Yeah, you might have people, the rare outlier that wants to get violent about this thing, but I suspect most people will just be like, I'm not really a fan of that statue this person has on their property. I'm curious as to what happens with actual private property where they do have statues like this, but rare is the outrage about it. It does happen, but it doesn't result in fighting over it, in all this violence over it, and all this protesting and begging the government to keep it or tear it down, and all this interpersonal aggravation with others that disagree with you and who are trying to keep you from getting what you want to happen with the property from happening, and you're trying to keep them from doing it. Whereas private property is so simple. Like, no one's going to, or very, very few people are going to get really angry at me for having a statue up on my property or trying to make me take it down because it's obviously not theirs. They don't need to worry about it. I mean, people put offensive things in their yard all the time. You should see the color my wife picked out for our rental property. It is such a odd green that I would be offended if I were any of the neighbors. But it's okay. That's fine. Because we have this beautiful system in place in some respects, in interpersonal citizen respects, that minimizes conflict because it's very clear about who has the right to do what with what. That got a lot more rambly than I wanted, but I hope it made some sense. The state creates conflict where there need be none, and a lack of enforcement of property rights, and having this thing called the state have some sort of property rights creates division among people who have different opinions, and makes these opinions have all this weight that they need not have, so that our different perspectives on particular topics divide us because it's about trying to control each other. Whereas in a private property system, it's easier to have a vast diversity of perspectives and opinions that differ from your neighbor, even aggressively in some ways, not violently aggressive, but very assertively disagree. It's easier to have those because you're not trying to control the other person by using the power of the state by proxy. So it's these we can have a greater diversity of ideology without without division, while still treating one another like humans, not having these very highly negative emotional responses that lead to highly destructive emotional outbursts. Harding, commentary on all that. Sorry, I did not mean to talk for that
Well,
long, but I know we were having trouble with conversing back and forth, so monologues.
that's fine. Well, the information is good. I would say though multiple points. First off, people get pissed off about what people do with their own property all the time, like Confederate flags in yards, or that one Halloween decoration of a hanged man that everybody thought was racist, and things like that happen all the like. There was this house in I forget exactly where it was, but it was near a suspension bridge, and it had pictures of kids with cardboard wings flying off of this bridge. And the guy who made this said that he wanted it to be an inspiration for childhood imagination. But the outrage police came through and said, "No, you're encouraging kids to jump off of bridges." So there's a certain thing we have these days that isn't necessarily based on certain areas deemed common property, but it's the idea that everybody's their neighbor's keeper because the government fundamentally owns everything. The government fundamentally has the rights to determine what happens with everything, and then
they fundamentally will determine by violence what happens with everything, but they don't have the right. Sorry to get nitpicky.
Well, no, I'm saying that it's this idea that they do.
Oh, okay, yeah. Sorry.
And so, like that combined with the other idea, which is also wrong, which is that the government is the people, means that essentially when you make that series of conflations, you can say that the government should be able to make decisions for all of the people, and any decision they make is reasonable, which means that when you say that, and when you have a participatory democratic process, what you eventually tell the people is, none of you really have total control over your property, because your neighbors do. And then it puts every neighbor against every other neighbor in a process of deciding how rights will be allotted. That's the cancer of democratic statism, and it's the idea that that people should be able to decide for each other how their property is used that has caused a lot of this division. But it's also the elites making very sure to control what the people think in terms of the ideas that are expressed in the corporate government-controlled media, the ideas that are expressed in education systems, which are indoctrination systems held over from the Prussian school system. There's a huge amount of precedent here for a very oppressive system that's designed to keep the people fighting each other, barking like dogs, at the latest problem du jour instead of actually solving anything. And that's what causes these issues, because property is a good fundamental concern for those who care about property rights.
Right.
But these people don't care about property rights, they care about pet issues being resolved. And that's the real problem.
Yeah. You bring up a good point there to kind of expand the idea that even our private property is in many ways held in common, and there is a much higher degree of respect amongst within communities for personal property rights than there is, I would say, than the property held in common. I mean, most people I know are much more likely to litter on the road than in someone else's yard. Does depend on your neighborhood, though. I've lived in a neighborhood where I picked up a lot of garbage from inside my fence, but still,
well,
in large part,
that's an interesting thing.
What's an interesting thing?
Oh, well, just people don't generally individually litter in yards. Most litter I've found that I've seen happening doesn't come from individuals in their yards. It comes from people with either very thin bags or no bags at all in large waste containers, like the ones that are on the streets, or
Yep.
dumpsters behind industrial places, or food places, especially that lots of little wrappers, and so I'll see like a big dump truck, especially out here in the high wind areas, pick up one of those big ass dumpsters, and suddenly there's litter everywhere, and like maybe because I worked at a Jack in the Box, and it was in the middle of a very windy, very dusty area. That's all I'll say, because I don't want to reveal my location if I don't have to. But the general thing was I would go out there and clean the parking lot. As part of my duties, I would sweep up shit, and I would sweep up all the sand that was in public walkways, and be very responsible. And things were clean, and then the big waste disposal truck would get there, and it would lift up that dumpster, and instantly the parking lot would be dirty again with all of the loosely packed trash that was either packed poorly by people inside, or not packed at all by people who just thought that they'd use the dumpster to deal with their road trip garbage. So it's not necessarily individuals throwing individual pieces of trash. It's the fact that as a society, partially because of the commons, we've grown incredibly irresponsible with how we treat our refuse. People say, I don't pollute. Yeah, you fucking do. You throw it in the trash, it doesn't go nowhere. It goes into a landfill, or it goes into everywhere else. And that means that essentially, because people have this set it and forget it attitude about the way garbage is handled, they're not gonna respect your property, because they're innately going to leave the respecting of your property and that responsibility to somebody else who works for a business that collects the crap. So there's that.
Yeah, I kind of depends on how we define pollution. Because I wouldn't necessarily call garbage going into a landfill pollution. It's merely a region whose use for humanity is to store stuff it doesn't want for now. Because if you're not damaging outside other people's property or harming that in any way, it doesn't seem to be that problematic. But it kind of depends on, like you're saying, how we'll define, or like I was saying, how we'll define pollution. And also the neighborhood that I was in, it was definitely individuals just throwing things into my yard every once in a while.
Oh, they didn't like you or something?
Nope. It was just a poor, lots of gang violence type neighborhood, and there were a higher percentage of individuals than other places I've lived that didn't really respect property rights. So I think they just did that periodically, and there was a fence they could throw it over easily, and I'd pick it up. I think it's Walter Block makes the point, though, that litter is only a problem in public spaces because in private areas, they just cleaned it up. Like, I clean up the trash in my yard, not an issue. I prevent it from getting over into other people's yards, which, would be a violation of their property rights. If I drop something on the ground in a restaurant, my wife and kid are looking at me from the outside window, so I was waving at them. If I drop something in the ground in the restaurant, they just cleaned it up. So it's not really a major issue until you get to these publicly owned spaces or publicly used spaces. Otherwise, it's just cleaning up garbage is a part of the cost of doing business. But this is a distraction. I want to say again, like, I think you made a really good point about the collectivism and the tendency of people to try to control other people's property, because I believe the presence of a democratic state, to build on what you're saying, is it has gotten people used to this proxy violence and has created a culture where proxy violence is deemed acceptable to violate other people's property rights, even if you would not.
I didn't hit him. I just called the cops.
As an individual. Yeah. I would never go over to their house and tell them to stop smoking weed or use violence to prevent them from letting that smell drift through my window, which was a smell I experienced last night, so it's fresh in my brain. But I just called the cops to do it. Like I
Yeah.
said, I just got some other people to go be violent on my behalf, and that's perfectly ethical because dumbass reason A, B, and C, and I don't care if those reasons are completely irrational or logically inconsistent or unable to be applied to everyone across all cases. That's what most people believe, so it's fine.
Yeah, well, and not to mention that, but like, I would never kill somebody over that. Well, would you call a cop? Would you hire an assassin? I mean, I might call a cop, but I wouldn't hire an assassin. Same thing. Sorry. Thanks for playing.
Very, very similar, yeah. No doubt. There's not hiring someone to do violence for you or voting for them to do violence for you are ethically right on par with one another. It's just one you're a little bit more directly connected to emotionally, so that feels more wrong.
Yeah, well, and that's
that
because
feeling.
people's emotions are rigged.
Emotions are easy to rig. That's for sure. I mean, that's what I used to think was rational. So I was a dumbass too.
Yeah, well, I used to be a bomb the Middle East, glass the sand like neoconservative. So I can't speak as though I've never been there, but I can speak as though I'm not there now, and other people can certainly join me.
Yeah, it's easy to criticize, or it's okay to criticize your past self at least. Yeah, I mean, I used to think that the only way for peace on earth was if all Muslims were killed. That's probably pretty close to what I thought in like 8th grade and stuff. I don't hold myself too accountable for that. Obviously, my thinking was quite manipulated, and it's really easy to manipulate the thinking of a child. Why, please be careful about sending your kids to both. They indoctrinate fucking crazy.
Well, and at least if you do, like, be responsible enough to school them more than your school schools them. Because if you can teach your children, for a few hours a day, every day that they go to public school, what the real shit is, or if you can at least provide them a strong ethical foothold so that they say in their own brain when they hear the shit at school that this isn't right, even though the teacher says it's right, even though an authority figure is saying so. If you can get them to question even you, to say no to you if you tell them to do something unethical, that's the best child. I want a daughter like Katniss Everdeen. That's what I want out of life.
Well, chromosomally, I have a son, but maybe I could help him become a daughter like Katniss Everdeen.
Well, then you should have a son like Neo.
A son like, yeah, there you go. All right. Let's get out of here, man. Anything you want to plug? I know you have that Teespring story. If you want to take a minute and share that. I forgot to get to that.
Oh, well, Moment of Rage. Insanity is free on Twitter. And most of my shirts are still available, but one of them got banned for being hate speech because it included the word Nazi, even though it was against Nazis and socialists in general.
So you were hating on Nazis.
Yes, but including the word Nazi, which isn't against their acceptable use policy, was apparently wrong. Even though they don't have like a list of banned words that I can't say,
right.
Apparently Nazi is one of them. So never have any shirt against Nazis in Teespring. They will ban your shirt because it's hate speech.
Here's what you need to do. Spell it Nahtzee. That's how I think it should be spelled anyway.
I'll get the gold edition with 4 sparkling dice.
I think when I first heard the word Nazi, the only word I had that was really close to it, or the word I had that sounded really close, was Yahtzee, and I definitely knew how that was spelled. So that was how I pictured that word for years. Yeah.
Go
for it. What's that?
Just coincidentally, that's how it would be pronounced in the pronunciation key.
Oh, okay. I had multiple classes on linguistics in college, and I don't know how to use the pronunciation key. Not sure how that happened. All right. If you want to follow me on Twitter at JeremiahJM, you can also follow the show's Twitter feed. And I've been a little inactive lately. I'm probably going to go on a few retweeting sprees, and that is at Chain Reaction. And I only retweet the best stuff. And the T in Chain Reaction is A1. I think that's it. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you had a good weekend and you're on your way to having a great week. And please be rational and keep things in their proper place with prioritization. Try not to get caught up in everything that everyone else gets caught up in unless you're very, very convinced that you should, because it's usually fucking stupid, relatively speaking. All right. Peace out, y'all. See you next week.